Microsoft Dynamics AX includes project budgeting functionality within the project management and accounting module. This helps companies monitor and control project revenue and expenditures. By comparing budget and actuals, your organization can reallocate money and resources to meet budgetary goals. Let's review project budgets in Dynamics AX. So our first question is, when should I use project budgeting or project budgets? Basically, there's two types of budgets inside of Dynamics AX. There's a cost budget and a revenue budget. And when I say in Dynamics AX, I mean in the project management and accounting module. If you're looking to track costs or analyze costs or even regulate costs on a project, that's a good example of when you should use a project budget. And the same for revenue as well. I know internally at Stoneridge, we use a revenue budget on all our projects, so we make sure that we're tracking actual revenue versus what we've budgeted for revenue, and we have warnings firing off if we get or go over any of our budgeted amounts. The next thing that you should be using, or a reason to use budget, would be if you need an audit trail of your budget changes. So basically, every time you create an original budget or revise the budget, the system's tracking that information. And there's also workflow controls around budget approval. So you just don't create a budget and just allow it to go through. It actually has to go through an approval process. So these are just a few of the reasons why to use project budgeting. And one thing, here we go. One thing that I wanted to show you is just the budgeting form before we leave this slide. So when you go into a project, you can actually launch the budgeting form, and you can see what I have highlighted are the costs and the revenue tabs. And this is basically where you can go in and define your budgets at either from a cost perspective or a revenue perspective or both. And in this situation, we're using both. But yeah, you can define what project it's for, what transaction type, what category, and then an amount. If you're looking to budget by quantities, that's available as well, and you can see that at each tab there's a details button, so you can add a line and go define details if you're looking to go to the quantity level. All right, just some key facts about project budgeting that I wanted to go through. So the first one is workflow is required. So basically, when you are using the budgeting functionality, whether it's the original budget or a budget revision, you are required to use workflow. So you have to set up and configure workflow in order to use project budgeting. The next thing to know is that forecast models are required, and we'll talk about those downstream. But in a nutshell, they're the container for all your budget information or forecast information. And you have to set up two of them, an original and a remaining. You must budget at a category level. So if you think back to the screenshot that we looked at the last slide, category is just a required field for every line on there. So you can budget at a more granular level. You can get down to the activity or the task level. But just note that any line is going to require a category. And this is important when you're setting up categories as well, that you know this information, because it could depict how you set up your categories. Because if you want to budget at a specific level, you're going to have a category at that level. Make sure to budget for all categories that will be used. So this is just a general best practice. If you don't budget for a specific category and you log actuals for that category, it's not going to show up on your project budget balance inquiry. So at Stoneridge, basically what we've done is we just budget for all our categories, whether it's got a value or not, just so it shows up on the report properly. Independent of GL budgeting, but works with it. So basically, project budgets are their own entity. They really are. So when you're creating a project budget, it has nothing to do with the general ledger budget that's set up in the budgeting module, unless you run a routine that actually transfers it to the general ledger budgeting. So just think, when you're creating a project budget, that it's its own entity, unless. Closely related to forecasts, this is just this bullet is basically defining that when you create a budget and submit and approve it, basically the back end is using forecasts. And we'll talk about forecasts later, but just note that the budgeting functionality uses the forecast structure to track transactions. Activities are optional. So I mentioned earlier that you can budget at the activity level, but it's not a required value when you put in a a budget, so you can track activities on your budget or not. So those are just a few key facts that I wanted to talk about prior to going to the next slide. Let's look at the process flow of how things operate, or the procedure in Dynamics AX. So first of all, there's two types of budgets. There's the original budget, and then there's a budget revision, and they each have their own specific workflow associated with each one. So if you have different approvers for your original budget than an actual budget revision, you can do that. But to create an original budget, basically you're going to create a project. Then there's a tab on that project where you actually have to turn budget tracking on, and you can have that defaulted as on from your project parameters, but there's quite a few other settings that you need to define as well, or have defaulted in appropriately. But once budget tracking is turned on, then you have to go into the budgeting form and create your original budget. Once you create your original budget and add all the lines that you want, then you submit your budget to workflow, and then workflow handles it from there. It will send it to the appropriate approvers, and once you get your budget approved, then your budget is active. And anytime you're logging any actuals, now the system's tracking those actuals towards the budget, and you can have the system basically telling, hey, you're over budget, or warning you, I guess warning or a hard stop, or not even caring. It's just basically you have a budget in there, and the system's not going to tell you whether you're over budget or not unless you go run a report and manually take a look. So there's also the entity of a budget revision, and with a revised budget, I mean, you're going to have your project created because you've already submitted an original budget and it's been approved. So to revise that, it's pretty straightforward. You're just going to go in and create a budget revision, then submit it to workflow, get it approved through workflow, and then once it's approved, that revision is now active. So that is the process flow within Dynamics AX.